Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today we're pleased to present How to Design Lean Startup Culture. I'm Jeanette DePatty from the Lean Startup Conference happening November 16th through 19th in San Francisco. Visit leanstartup.co for more information. Our speakers today are Alexander Osterwalder and Kirsten Cluthy, who will be moderating questions from the audience. Dr. Alexander Osterwalder is the lead author of the international bestseller Business Model Generation, passionate entrepreneur and demanded speaker. He co-founded Strategizer, a software company specializing in tools and content for strategic management and innovation. Dr. Osterwalder invented the Business Model Canvas, the strategic management tool to design, test, build, and manage business models, which is used by companies like Coca-Cola, GE, P&G, MasterCard, Ericsson, Lego, and 3M. He is a frequent keynote speaker in leading organizations and top universities around the world, including Stanford, Berkeley, MIT, IESE, and IMD. Kirsten Cluthy is the editorial director for the Lean Startup Conference. Now here's a few housekeeping notes. We'll take questions from the audience via the live chat. If you'd like to ask a question, please flag it with the letter Q followed by a colon. The speakers will answer the questions mostly in the second half of the webcast, so there's no reason to ask your questions twice. And this will be about a 1-hour program, and the recording will be available a few days after this live webcast. Take it away, Kirsten.
Thanks, Jeanette. Alex, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm very happy to have you here, even though it's evening in Switzerland. I wanted to just get started by setting some context because you wrote the Business Model Canvas, and now one of the things you're going to talk about at the Lean Startup Conference is how to design a lean startup culture. So I kind of want to know, how did you get to the cultural aspect? How did you end up there?
So first of all, I guess those who followed my work and my company's work a bit know that we're pretty obsessed by business tools. So we started out with the Business Model Canvas, then we went on with the Value Proposition Canvas, more focused on value creation for customers. But while working with companies, one of the things that we've really seen is that the corporate culture part is extremely important if you want to develop great business models and great value propositions by testing them, so you decrease the risk, so applying the whole lean startup process. So we came up with a third tool, if you want. There's a series of tools, but these are the big ones, called the Culture Map, and we developed that together with somebody called Dave Gray, who built a company called Explain, who is a serial author, and we collaborated with him to create the Culture Map in order to help companies create different kinds of cultures: innovation cultures, lean startup cultures, customer-centric cultures. And the funny thing is, it's a really simple tool, but it helps people talk about this topic that's really kind of fuzzy. If you ask somebody, can you design corporate culture? They will look at you and think, what? I mean, what even is corporate culture? We don't even, have a shared language or definition. So that's why we really went into that topic and said, hey, I think, we can make a tool that will help people design the kind of corporate culture that they want, the desired culture that they want to see in their companies.
So is the culture map sort of the result of working with a lot of different organizations and determining that the people obviously are one of the most important assets, and so it's a way to help people find the right culture that fits their objectives? Is that sort of...
So the starting point was, what a lot of business authors have written about, that most companies are dominated by an execution culture. At GE, they would call that the execution engine, right? And today, that there are companies that are being disrupted, or young startups are creating disruptive companies, we also have to think about an innovation culture. Besides, not to replace the execution culture, because you want that, you want to keep that, but you want to create another culture, and some academics call this a dual operating system. I like that term. Companies need to figure out how to do that, and that's very hard. So during our work, helping companies to innovate, we saw that they were struggling with that. They were struggling with implementing lean startup processes. They were struggling with creating an entrepreneurial kind of ecosystem. they're not lacking entrepreneurs, but they're lacking the space, and I don't just mean a physical space, I mean an organizational space to actually let their innovations breathe, to do experiments, to allow failure and learning to happen, because that's the only way you can create an innovation culture. So seeing that, we thought, hey, what could we do? And then, kind of by coincidence, Dave Gray was starting to work on business tools. We got him excited about that because that's what we're all about at Strategizer. And he was interested in organizational culture. So it really fit what we were trying to do, create an innovation culture with what he was trying to do, which was trying to create a tool around organizational culture in general. So while this tool allows you to do a lot of things, I think what's most interesting for our conversation that we're having here and for the problems that we're facing when we're implementing lean startup processes in large organizations is that we need a tool to help us think about how to create this lean startup culture. And it's not easy because we're talking about living systems, right? With incentives, with organizational processes, with power structures. So there are a lot of things we need to put in place. And I don't think we can do that if we don't have the right tools to get started. Of course, you need a lot of other things like a willingness of the leadership. But I think we have those things. So we're seeing leaders willing to implement this culture, but they don't know how to proceed.
You said a couple of scary words there, like failure, for example. So I imagine that, especially with an enterprise organization or a large organization, it sounds great in theory, but it's difficult to implement or get started. So, what do companies, whether large or small, need to consider before they start adopting this culture? I mean, does there have to be a serious pain point for them to start thinking, oh, okay, maybe we really need to do something? Or is it just something that is just sort of goes with the idea of growth and innovation, and it's sort of a necessary part of that process?
I think there is some convincing to be done. I think that mostly the leadership buys into this idea that we need to find new processes, and experimentation, failure, and learning is part of that. But I'm not so sure they really know how to do that. I think the bigger issue is to convince middle management in large organizations. They already have a full agenda, a lot of things to do. Why would we want to do something like this? Why would we want to put this in place? So I think the first step is a little bit more convincing, even before the sense of urgency. I think the sense of urgency is there to a certain extent. A lot of companies are being disrupted. Happened to Kodak. Nokia went from 10 years ago they were at the top of the mountain. They were the number one. Where are they today? So things are happening very fast, and not just in the technology industry. You're seeing the same thing in the pharmaceutical industry. So I think the urgency is there. What needs to still come across a bit is that failure, if you deal with it the right way, and if you don't, we're not talking about big failures here, still not a good thing to lose $500 million or $1 billion, happening all the time in innovation. I think that failure can be managed. We need to convince people that actually the more you fail and learn, the more you decrease risk and uncertainty. I think that message is coming across slowly, but it's not clear enough. It's not clear enough why that actually works. The way I like to frame it, and this is how I sell lean startup to large companies and tell them why it's a good thing to fail. When you start and go from idea to business, so you have an idea for a new product, you have an idea for you want to create a new product around a new technology, you will start with a brainstorming session and try to make your idea a bit more concrete. At that point, at the beginning, uncertainty is at its highest. And the worst thing you can do is write a business plan. And unfortunately, large companies still ask people at that stage to write a business plan or make a business case with clear numbers. The problem is, that's when risk is at its highest. So refining your idea at that point means actually you're maximizing your risk. It means you're going to execute something that has a very high probability to fail. So business plans don't work because they're an execution instrument. So if you tell people that at the moment that you start, risk is at its highest, uncertainty is its highest, and you need to make small experiments to learn and decrease that uncertainty, and increase your investments in experiments slowly while you're decreasing uncertainty, they get that immediately. Saying, okay, I'm going to experiment, invest maybe $10,000 to do first customer surveys, learn something from that. I'm going to probably learn that I was wrong. Then I can change my direction, I can change my value proposition, my business model, and my next experiment will be a little bit more expensive because I did learn, I decreased uncertainty. Now I probably am on a slightly better path, so I can invest a bit more and experiment a bit more. So that is the message we need to communicate a bit clearer. And then the next step is actually the hard one, is okay, people are convinced, how do I get started? What do I have to put in place? Because it's not enough to have the tools, it's not enough to know, okay, lean startup process. In large companies, you need to change a lot of things. You need to change the power structures to a certain extent. You need to change how decisions are made. You need to change the incentive system so people actually dare to fail. Because today, working in innovation, sorry to break the news, but working in innovation or leading an innovation initiative is probably career suicide in most organizations. It shouldn't be that way, but today it is. And it's slowly changing, and some organizations are figuring out how to do that. And we should learn more from that and look into that so we can change organizational cultures to create those innovation engines besides the execution engines.
So that's you mentioned some things that can get in the way of creating this culture of innovation. What are, in your experience, with some of the people that you've worked with, not no specifics, but what are some of the things that hinder companies really from doing this? So what are some of the reasons why they would say no, we can't do we can't change the culture, or we can't change the incentive program, etc.
Yeah. So the first one might actually not even be a willingness, a lack of will to change. So I ran a couple of large innovation projects with great brand names. The first is to change the mindset. These are, mostly people who were trained to execute. These were people who were trained to make business cases, to write business plans, to present the perfect pitch to their senior leaders before they do anything. Like, that was hammered into their heads, to use a bit of a visual image. So getting them to say, no, we're going to work with rough ideas. We're going to prototype a value proposition in a workshop, and the next day we're out there in the street, if we're in a consumer goods talking to customers, or if we're in B2B, we're going to fly across the world and talk to potential customers. That is a change of attitude, right? So that's the first thing. We need to just get people used to do this. So I'll give you an example. With one company, I got them to do a big kind of lean startup approach before investing in technology prototyping. So rather than building something literally, they would actually, prototype, build their business model prototypes and value proposition prototypes, conceptually sketch them out, and then go play around and talk to customers, do landing pages before building anything, kind of physically in terms of technology prototype. So they would do a couple of surveys, and then they would already be happy. They'd say, oh yeah, we got strong validation because we, talked to 100 people in our survey. And they say, no. The attitude here is you got some insights, but now you need to do some type of call to action, because just asking people, they will tell you whatever they want to tell you, but their behavior is probably different. Even if they're not ill-intentioned, they're probably going to behave differently in real life. So please, let's try to do experiments. To get companies who've done surveys for so long and who've kind of refined their ideas rather than testing them immediately, that's super hard to do. So it's first step is to train people to do this. You can't become a heart surgeon overnight, so why would you be able to become good at doing lean startup and experimenting overnight? It's a completely different attitude. So that's the first step, even beyond the obstacles, right? That's the first difficult one. Then the other difficult one is that you need to have senior leaders and those who do projects aligned on this idea of rough prototyping and testing before we actually to produce the evidence and proof that this is going to work. Unfortunately, in many large companies that I've seen, a great business plan still looks like evidence or proof that an idea is going to work. though now we can show that that is probably evidence that you're not doing your job right, that you're maximizing the risk of failure. Business plans maximize the risk of failure rather than minimizing them. But that needs to, we need to have leaders trained and the people who do it trained. Because what if this team, works with rough ideas and goes to present them, and the leadership hasn't bought into this yet and says, "Oh, you're crazy, you're trying this out early." So we need to kind of train leadership and the doers at the same time. Then I think back to the incentive part, there are two things. One is we need to reward experimentation and failure. So once the mindset is there, we also need to invite people to do more of this by giving out the right rewards. Celebrating failure, but not just failure, of course. The learning part is what we really want to celebrate, and you might actually succeed and learn, so let's not just focus on failure. That's one. But then I think the biggest obstacle that I've seen so far, and that's the hardest one to overcome, I think, is the power aspect. Today, many of the innovation teams I come across they're super pumped, they're excited about what they're doing, they're living these lean startup processes, they're using the business model canvas and the value proposition canvas, but they have relatively little clout in the organization. And the reason is simple. What gives you prestige in a large company? It's budget and it's people. That's the exact contrary of what you need to do in the lean startup approach. What do? You actually start lean. You start with a small team with little money. So there's no prestige in that. So the important thing is that we give prestige to this lean way of doing things, of experimenting. We need to give power to those who are actually creating the future. These are probably the most important people in your company because they're creating the future. Unfortunately, today they're not seen that way. Only few companies have done that. Just one example. I get excited about this, so I talk so much. But Singtel, the Singaporean telecom operator, has addressed that issue of power by taking the number 5 in their company, stripping him of budget and people, and putting him in the role in charge of creating a new innovation project. By taking somebody in particular in an Asian culture who had so much power and putting him in that position is really a symbolic thing. Today, I think this is not happening enough in large companies, that people who have done it, who have clout in a company, they really take on this innovation role, but without, too much budget or too many people, because that will lead to waste. That's the kind of symbolic change we need to do. One of the things we propose is that we create the chief corporate entrepreneur as a position right at the top, right beside the chief executive reporting to the board. Then you would have a real power structure that would give innovation real clout in the organization. I think it's really a power issue beyond all of the tools and processes and mindsets that we need to change.
That's interesting. It almost makes me wonder. I was going to ask you if you felt that entrepreneurship is a role that large organizations should consider developing or including in their system to support that, because in a way the word entrepreneur has a very specific meaning instead of innovation, which is much more ambiguous, right? So people can wrap their heads around it.
That's why we wrote a Harvard Business Review blog post on that. We called it a chief corporate entrepreneur, and we drew an org chart, since that's the language that many people speak in large organizations, and we put the chief executive on the one side, who has the CFO, who has the CMO, the chief marketing officer, chief financial officer, and then the other side, right beside the CEO at the same level, we put the chief corporate entrepreneur, who reports to the board, to the executive board. And the reason why we did that is because people always tend to put innovation, and this buzzword that means a lot of things to many people, in R&D, but it's not. The traditional technology R&D usually or often today, it helps with sustaining innovation. What we need, in addition to that, I'm not saying we should replace that, we need technology and product innovation, but what we need is a space where we can search for new value propositions and new business models. We need that entrepreneurial space. That's what's lacking. We're not lacking, I think, the entrepreneurs. I think those exist in large companies. We have the people with ideas, and I would think it's very hard to find a company where you don't have those entrepreneurs and innovators till they actually leave because they're frustrated, but they're there. What we need is a structure where entrepreneurship can live and breathe, and in large companies. And that doesn't mean they need to build everything, but you need to have this space. I like to call this the space where you create, a new portfolio of business models and value propositions where new things can emerge. You can also acquire as a large company, but you also need to develop. If it's only to learn what works and what doesn't, you'll be an even better acquisition machine if you've learned internally, because it's very hard to acquire without having done the learning. So experimentation when it comes to business models and value propositions has to happen if companies don't want to become disposable companies. Otherwise, they will, go down the same route as Kodak and Nokia. It's going to happen to more companies in the future if they can't reinvent their organizational structures, if they can't create an entrepreneurial space. And again, not the physical space, but the organizational space with the right reward structures, with the right incentives and skills and everything. That does not exist in most companies at the right level. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist. We have incubators, we have everything, but you could almost call this, Steve Blank likes to call this innovation theater, because it doesn't have the power it should have to really invent the future of a specific company.
So where would, if somebody is in an organization and they know that they want to change and create a culture that supports innovation, an entrepreneurial culture, who should take responsibility for that? Where is a good place to start? Because when I'm listening to you speak, I think, well, at senior executive level, people have to buy in, so that's obvious. But they're not necessarily the ones that make the change happen. It could be the HR department, although that seems like a stretch or too difficult. So what are your thoughts on where somebody would start with this?
So it can come from many different places, and I think it will be, to succeed, a bottom-up and a top-down movement. So what we're seeing, if I'm just looking at how the business model canvas and the value proposition canvas spread, is very much a bottom-up movement, where people who are working on innovation, who are working in product management, who are working in sales, they would start using these tools. They would start promoting these tools and the lean startup approach because they're excited about it. And I think that's a great way to start. What we need now is also to connect those grassroots movement or bottom-up movements with the top, and it can come from anywhere. So I think the biggest ones we see is in product management. Innovation, some of the innovation initiatives, those are not always the most powerful ones because they're not as established. But then where we're seeing a lot of this happening is actually marketing and sales. So we're seeing salespeople and marketers getting excited about the value proposition canvas, and once they're interested in that, we also show them, hey, you want to combine this with the lean startup process to reduce your risk of failure when you introduce new ideas. So I would say the more it starts in an established part of the company, the likelier it is to get to the top in a quicker way. So typically take the call to action testing rather than just talking to people, which is a great start, don't get me wrong. Doing call to actions, that typically can really take off in a marketing department. And I'm actually seeing that in one of the projects I did with one of the biggest consumer goods in many mouths around the world. They promoted this in the marketing department, and they're now systematically doing call to action tests, not just surveys. So I think that established functions are those who can get it to the top the quickest, almost more surprisingly than the innovation functions, because they already have a hard time to fight for budget, etc. in most organizations. From my little window on the world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So can you talk a little bit about the idea of a culture map or a lean startup culture or culture design, and the difference between doing that in a startup organization versus doing it in an enterprise organization?
Yeah, you face slightly different issues. So the culture map, is something we created so you can design culture, so you can go from an as-is culture to a desired culture. And obviously, when you're in a large company, you have an as-is culture. It's more and more important aspect than in a startup. You start from scratch, right? When we designed this culture map, we really wanted to keep it simple. We worked with Dave Gray to design it in the most simplest way. We ended up with something that's so simple, I'm almost embarrassed to present it, but it actually works. That's the good news. It just has three aspects. What are the outcomes you want to produce? What's the behavior you want to see in your organization, which could be a company or a department or a group, a team? What are the behaviors you want to see to create those outputs? And then here's the interesting one. What are the enablers and blockers that you have in your company that lead to that behavior? So typically, if you have a lack of innovation in your company, it's probably because you lack some of the enablers and you have a series of blockers. Like you reward execution, like you insist on business plans, etc. So by simply mapping out those three things, let's start with an existing company. Mapping out, take a team and they map out the as-is culture. What are the outcomes that we have today, negative or positive? Are we innovative? Are we not innovative? Do we collaborate? Don't we collaborate? What's the behavior that leads to that? Like we produce business plans, we work on projects that lead to incremental innovation. And then you ask yourself, this is the most difficult part, well, what are actually the enablers that we have today in our team, for example, or in our company that lead to those behaviors? Let's get to the roots, and you just map those out. By simply having those three elements, Google Culture Map and Strategizer, and you'll find it immediately. You can download it for free and use it. By simply getting a team to discuss those three elements, you get a wonderfully tangible conversation going on organizational culture. It's as simple as that. So that's your as-is culture. Now you take a new canvas, new culture map, you put it on another wall, and you ask yourself, okay, what are the outputs we desire? What is the behavior we would need to have to create those outputs? And what enablers could we put in place, and which blockers would we have to kill or eliminate to lead to that behavior? And there you have it. You have what you would need to work on, those enablers and blockers, to create the kind of behavior you want that will lead to the kind of outputs you want. It's super simple, but the magic is actually in visualizing it. By putting up a poster, having those conversations, you really get to that. That's in an existing company. Now let's look at a startup. Soon as you go from 1 to 2 people, you have organizational culture because you have a founding team, or you start having employees. You want to design the type of culture you want to see in your company. You want to be data-driven. You want to be, test all of your ideas and have evidence before you make the big decisions. That's culture. That's a behavior you need to boost, and you'll boost that by putting in place the right enablers and by blocking the bad behaviors you don't want to see. So it starts from 2 people onwards. The good news is you don't have the kind of legacy behavior that you have in large companies. That's the great thing. Some people also ask, well, when do we start? I think the earlier the better. We started almost late to a certain extent. In our company, we're now 20 people at Strategizer. Now this year, we started systematically working with the culture map. I think it's a very, very powerful tool because it allows you to visualize something and design something that people thought couldn't be designed, simply because we now can make it a bit more tangible. So I think it applies in different ways for different reasons in large companies and in startups. In large companies, it's usually to transform a culture, for example, from an execution culture to an innovation culture. In a startup, it's really more about the desired culture you want to see in your company, probably starting with the founding team. What kind of culture do they want to see? And I think a lot of the young founders today, or the entrepreneurs today, crave for those kind of tools because they want to create a different kind of culture, because today we can do that. We're aspiring, a lot of the entrepreneurs today are aspiring to create different organizations where people are excited to work, not just show up for work, do their job, because you probably won't have a chance to keep your employees. Silicon Valley, they run away because there's so many opportunities. You need to have a great culture, and that's not bringing your dog to work or playing ping pong. That's the right behavior that you want to put in place.
So we're getting a lot of questions. So I'm going to start moving over to ask you some questions. But there's one question I wanted to ask before I do that, and I wanted to know what your definition is of a great workplace. How would you define a great modern workplace?
Yeah. So let me start. Yeah. It's a super good question, because if take any company today, the biggest. I always hated this way of framing it, but people talk about war for talent, right? But I do think today people have more choices than ever if they're talented, if they're skilled, if they're nice and great people to work with as well, because talent and skill is one thing, but they should be decent people as well, hopefully. To attract those people and keep them, we really need to create the right kind of organizational culture. Let me take a step back and just kind of define what I think is a great company today. For me, there are four things to be a great company. Number one, you need to create a profit-spitting machine, because otherwise you won't survive, you won't grow. So that's number one. We created the business model canvas for that. The second one is you want to create value propositions that excite customers. We created the value proposition canvas for that. And you can be a great profit-spitting company and not excite customers. Banks have a tendency to do that, to create a common enemy here. But I think great companies can do both. They get customers excited and they make money. But then comes the third one. And I do think you need the first two first to be able to really focus on the third one. And the third one is great companies also get their employees excited. And they're obviously linked. I think the more you can get your employees excited to work for you, the more you will create great products, the more you will become a profit-spitting machine. So I do think those three are linked. And for that third one, we created the culture map, simply because if you look at the statistics, the Gallup poll did a study. 7 out of 10 people are either not engaged or actively disengaging at work. 7 out of 10. That's a lot, right? That means look around you, 7 people at work, maybe not at your organization, not at mine, of course, but those are the statistics, and that Gallup poll does serious work. So 7 out of 10 employees in companies today are not engaged or are actively disengaging. That's just not sustainable. And if you're a company that wants to live and thrive, you want people who are engaged at work, who enjoy work, who come to work excited every day and give their best. Then you need to create a great workplace. So I do think organizational culture is important for that particular reason also, to create a great workplace so they can also do great work. And not just, you don't want to squeeze them like a lemon. I think there are a lot of companies that have been in the press also and that create great products and make a lot of profit, but aren't necessarily the best place to work at. I think the company of the 21st century does all three. And then there's a fourth one that I didn't mention. I firmly believe that great companies have those three aspects, and a fourth one, they also change the world in a positive way at the same time. And I do think if you can create a better workplace and happier employees, you actually already made a contribution to the world that's substantial. If you can do poverty alleviation, is even better. But I think even without going to those crazy ambitious goals, which I think you can do today with making profit, but just creating a better workplace will already create a better world. So for me, those are 4 pieces that create a great company: profit-spitting machine, get customers excited, get employees excited, and change the world for the better. And I think there are more and more tools for that. The last one, we're still lacking. We need a tool for that one too. I think the culture map is a step forward to create great workplaces, not just innovative with lean startup culture, which is also a step forward because it will give innovators a space to be excited and do their work. Because today, most of them in large companies, they leave. They try once, they try 2 times, and then why not go off and create your own company? You'll have more fun, you'll probably earn more money, but that also means large companies are losing their best employees, those who can create their best innovation employees who can create the future. They will be stuck with all the executors, which is not enough. You need that, but you need both. You need great executors, and you need great people who can invent the future, the searchers, the explorers, the entrepreneurs. The company of the future can attract and keep both the executors and the entrepreneurs.
That's great, and actually it answers one of the questions we had, which is other than mine, which is why is culture so important for business? So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna pull up some of the questions that are coming from the audience. What are the biggest challenges in managing an innovation culture for companies that are used to being entrenched in execution culture?
Well, I think, really that idea that you need to experiment, you need to try out things, and at the risk of failure, but not just failure, success also, and learn and iterate. That's, I think, the difficult part. Understanding that innovation and entrepreneurship within a company is not a linear process. It's actually a messy one, but one that can be orchestrated. Getting that message across is the most difficult piece. Execution is linear. You go from, idea to planning to execution, and that works when you work on version X of the iPhone or so, which also has a part of innovation, but it's not as substantial as if you bring out the iPhone the first time, right? So innovation, lean startup culture has to do with a messy process that can be orchestrated, but it's not linear. You advance, you fail, you regress, and that's part of the process. Regression is actually part of the process, but you have evidence of what didn't work and what works, and you will make more progress, but it's back and forth, up and down. You have a value proposition that looks like it can work, and then you realize, oh, that value proposition would cost way too much money to make, so you need to change the business model. That messy process, showing and teaching execution-oriented companies that messy process is mandatory if you want to create the future, that's the tough part. And I think the way to teach it, to get people excited, is to say, hey, you want to decrease the risk of big failure? Well, you have to reduce uncertainty, and you can only do that by experimentation. Otherwise, you will, have big risks, and you'll make big wild-ass gambles, like Rita McGrath, and one of my favorite academics, likes to say. But you're likely to fail. It's a bet, and innovation shouldn't be a bet. It should be calculated little bets.
So this ties a little bit to the next question, which is how do you get middle management executives to build the patience to fail, especially when, and I'm sure you've encountered this before, they're moving jobs every few years and they really just want to be a success under their belt before they go or before they transition?
Yeah. So I think part of the issue is that we expect people who are have the mandate to execute to also innovate. Typically, in innovation projects, they put a team together. They're looking for the right skills. These are people who have a day job, and then between the workshops, they should do experimentation and learning. It's super tough. It requires a different skill set. It requires them to work differently. Like from the morning until maybe 3 o'clock, they should be execution oriented, and then from 3 o'clock until 8 o'clock in the evening, they should be scientists that experiment. I'm not sure if that's the best thing to do, and that's because we're at the early stages of innovation. Scott Anthony, one of my other favorite thinkers, he has this analogy. He says, Michael Jordan was a great basketball player, and he's a very decent baseball player, but he never became, a major league baseball player. So it's the Michael Jordan phenomenon. If you really want, the best in an area, well, go look for the best and don't try to make people do two things that they shouldn't be doing. So while innovation should always be able to draw on execution skills, I'm not sure if the same people should be doing both. In particular, it's very schizophrenic. Like in the morning, they have different incentives. They're rewarded to execute, and failure is not an option. And on the afternoon, they're rewarded to experiment, and failure is actually mandatory. That makes no sense, right? You can't give the same person a very different reward system. So it's very dangerous to ask the same middle managers to do two tasks that require so different skill sets. So probably you want to have a core team that specializes in innovation and draws on skills coming from the execution engine, and vice versa. The execution engine is focused on that and draws on skills every now and then coming from the innovation engine. So I think separating those roles probably makes more sense, but still collaborating together is super important.
So is there sort of a tool, or there's a place in the culture map where you're looking at the existing structure and you have to identify the people that are the execution people and the people that are sort of the more entrepreneurial idea people, and somehow get them to collaborate? Have you worked with organizations where you sort of have to bring those two together and have them self-identify, or have HR, whoever, identify them?
Yeah, so not specifically in the culture map. So we like to create, when I say we, it's just, Yves Pigneur, myself, Dave Gray, and Alan Smith, all these people who work around in Strategizer, around Strategizer, and others, and anybody working on business tools. We like to make one tool for one specific business issue. And I think the organizational structures are another issue they lead to organizational culture, but you would almost want to use another tool like org charts or the STAR model by Galbraith. But it is a super important issue. And let me answer the question a bit differently, not directly to what you asked, but what we see a lot is that you have the improve side, the execution engine, you have the invent side, which is the innovation engine. And today, we don't really have separate structures, so we should have them. I mentioned before, it could be interesting to have the CEO managing the existing company and the execution part, the chief corporate entrepreneur managing the future, the entrepreneurial future. But in between, what if we created another job profile called either the chief concierge or the chief internal ambassador, which is another nice term, who builds the bridges between both sides? Because let's say you're running an innovation project, you're practicing all these lean startup processes, there are moments you need to draw on the skills and resources that exist in your company. Otherwise, you're a startup like any other one, but with shackles, like you're constrained. The advantage that large companies have is that they have access to great people with great skills. They have access to customers if their sales force gives them access. So the chief internal ambassador, this middleman or middlewoman, would have to create that legitimacy to give these innovation teams access to those resources. And we all know that today, if you're doing lean startup in a large company, salespeople won't want to give you access because they're afraid you're going to mess up their customer relationship, which I can understand, right? Oh no, these crazy guys are coming in with new ideas. They might undermine my margins, or they might confuse my customers. And so we need to do that in an orchestrated way. And we need structures that allow these two sides of the company, these two cultures, to collaborate as partnerships. It can't be that the innovation culture is seen as a pirate culture because they create the future. And the pirates, the innovators, can't see the execution culture as old farts because they're actually financing them. It should be a partnership. And that is not the case. So we need to really have these middle men or middle women, I like to call them the chief internal ambassador, that build these bridges so we can collaborate. Otherwise, it's going to be very tough for these corporate entrepreneurs to survive because they're fighting against really nimble and fast startups. And the only thing that these corporate startups have is access to crazy great resources if that access can be granted and managed. And I'm not just talking about money, I'm talking really about all the other things like brand, customers, skills internally, patents, etc.
Yeah. So another question, and this is a good question. What are your thoughts on innovation colonies external to the corporation versus internal innovation departments, or
Yeah.
and the chief entrepreneurial, because some companies do well one way and others do well the other way. If they don't, especially if they can't build that innovation culture. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. I partially touched on that a bit earlier. I think every company needs to find their way of doing it. I don't think there's a right answer. I'm really against dogma, right? Every industry, every company has its own kind of way of doing things and should find their own solution that works for them. I do, however, think companies should play kind of on the whole range, from trying things internally, experimenting internally, all the way to in the whole acquisition tool set. You shouldn't go for one or the other. Like I said a bit earlier, if you've learned internally, you got signals from the market, what works, what doesn't, where interest is, where there's no interest, you will make better decisions when you acquire a company. If you acquire a company without that knowledge, that experimentation, you can really screw up, I think. So even if you experiment internally without the intention, because you're not good at it, of creating and growing companies, I think you still learn so much that will allow you to become better at acquiring companies. Then the other thing is, once you acquire a company, well, guess what? You probably want to have some type of entrepreneurial culture otherwise they're going to die. You're going to suffocate them, right? Which is happening all the time. Kellogg's just did that recently and is suffering. They bought a brand, and the sales went down because they were centralizing the whole thing. So I think you need to play on the whole, instrumentarium from trying to build internally all the way to acquisition. It's a portfolio that you need to build, and you need to take advantage of all of those tools.
So in a way, the approach needs to be very similar, and if you are acquiring a company especially, you need to act as if it's going to eventually be your own entrepreneurial organization, yeah. Right?
And I think that the interesting thing is, like, if you have this execution engine, if you have this place where you can live the lean startup culture and grow companies, there's a moment you're going to have to decide, is this going to now become part of the execution engine? Because when it's big enough, what do, right? Does it live on its own? Does it become part of the larger company, or do we spin it out? That's a skill set that we really need to develop, and it's not easy. Typically, one of my favorite case studies is Nespresso, owned by Nestle. Nespresso is now a multi-billion-dollar business, and Nestle is kind of asking, well, Nespresso lived on its own for a while. Are we going to really, take it into the Nestle org chart and take away their freedom? Very dangerous. Might be the right move. I think in that particular case, why not let that company go on and support them actually to innovate a little bit more? So these are choices to be made once a company has grown up. It's not a startup anymore. How does it live on in the org chart? And I think in general, this is going to become a lot more complicated. So we like to talk about, the next wave that's going to be difficult to manage is business model portfolios. It used to be that you had one business model and you managed that through different continents, etc., or you were a conglomerate, you had different businesses. But today it's a lot more sophisticated. Just take Nestle with their coffee business. They have several different business models there. They have several different machines that look like Nespresso machines. They have one called Baby Nest. So there's also pods. You put them in a machine, you press a button. It's not Nespresso coming out, not espresso, it's baby formula. So where do you put that in your org chart? Is that a separate company? Does it live close to Nespresso because it uses the same technology? So we're going to increasingly have to manage business model portfolios and kind of align the org chart that was easier, decades ago than today. Align that org chart with the business model portfolio and value proposition portfolio. And align that with executing existing business models, improving those, and inventing new ones. The world is becoming a lot more sophisticated. That's one of the reasons why we need more sophisticated tools to do a better job at it.
So another question from the audience: how do you measure corporate culture to be able to see if your designed or intended corporate culture is actually materializing?
So I think here's that's a super interesting question. So we combined the business model canvas and the value proposition canvas with the lean startup approach, right? And we created some tools like the test card or the learning card to make those experiments explicit. When we designed the culture map, we saw it as an exactly, as a very similar tool to the business model canvas or value proposition canvas, saying you can design a value proposition that you would like to create, but you don't know if the market is going to be interested, so you have to test it. Same thing, you can design a desired culture, but you're going to have to test if those enablers and blockers that I was talking about before, if they actually work. So you're going to use lean startup experiments to test if those enablers or blockers work. Like we would think financial incentives might work, but what if we tested that before we roll it out, on a large scale? So I think we need to do exactly the same thing when we design an organizational culture in a team or larger in a business division or in an entire company. We need to test the enablers, the drivers that we want to put in place, just like we would test elements of a value proposition, just like we would test the hypothesis underlying our business model. It's the same thing. So we designed those tools in exactly the same way. Business model canvas, the value proposition canvas, the culture map have the same kind of behaviors. You have an as-is business model, you have an as-is culture. You have an as-is value proposition, you have an as-is culture. And you want to design something, you're going to have to test it. You don't know if it's going to work. Same thing. So we can apply lean startup principles, build, measure, learn, to the design of culture exactly the same way. And I'm convinced that we'll see more of that happening in the future. That's why we designed our tools that way. So they're completely compatible with everything else we do around lean startup tools.
That ties well to the next question, which is, what is a good process to get started actively working on and designing corporate culture? Is it similar to setting up build, measure, learn feedback loops?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're in an existing company, what I would do first is just map the existing culture with a team. Let's say you start with a small team, or if you're looking at a business division, Dave Gray did this a couple of times. You would do this with a couple of different teams in a company to see if there are shared behaviors and patterns, etc. Then you design with a group of people the desired culture. You use a separate culture map to do that. And then you ask yourself, same like with a business model, what has to be true for this desired culture to work? What are the most critical assumptions? Is it that we need the right building? Is it that we need the right incentives? Is it that we need new processes? And then you design an experiment to test that hypothesis, just like you would do it for a value proposition, a product, or technology. And we haven't done that much, I'll be very honest, because we just started using the culture map systematically. What we have done is already started with some of the straightforward stuff. We built action plans based on the desired culture, but can be, if you're on a bigger transformation initiative, that can be very dangerous. It's like writing a business plan. It could blow up in your face. So taking desired culture and then writing an action plan, how to implement that, can be dangerous if you're not really sure that your hypothesis underlying that desired culture are true. So you need to test, just like you would do for a product, a value proposition, or a business model.
So I have a question around that idea. And building or testing with a culture is different than testing a product or a technology, because you're dealing with people in a different way. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of, do you create sort of a beta experiment group so it's very transparent, especially if you're dealing with bonus structure or incentives and that sort of thing. I can imagine it could be tricky to be able to experiment in that way when you're really dealing with the way that people are working every day. So
I think it's pretty straightforward, actually. So when we designed the value proposition canvas, we looked at customers and we defined customers that, as people or organizations having jobs, pains, and gains. And you would go test if those jobs, pains, and gains are true. And it's the same thing for enablers and blockers in organizations. You would go try to figure out, are those really going to enable a certain behavior or not? Now, of course, when it comes to some things, it can be very sensitive when you're talking about bonuses, but I think you can really test behavior by doing small experiments. Because at the end of the day, what is culture? It's behavior that forms over time, and it forms over time because certain behaviors are rewarded and certain behaviors are punished. So I do think you can figure out what those drivers of behaviors are, but you need to experiment. You might actually think one driver is going to work, like setting up a specific type of collaborative meeting every Monday. You can test that. Did it lead to some behavioral change, or do we have exactly the same thing? So it might not be exactly the same type of experiments, but I think it's the same thing. When we're talking about products and services, it's also about behavior. Let's say you have a new product or technology that requires some behavioral change. You have to figure out if that's going to happen. Buying a product is a behavior. You have to figure out if that's going to happen or not. So I think it's very similar. When it comes to business models and products and services, we're talking about behavior just as much as we're talking about behavior in organizational culture. So I believe we can test it the same way. I think we haven't worked enough on the testing aspect of the culture map to give very concrete advice. So right now, I agree, this is still a bit more hypothetical, but we designed it in a way that we can do more of that. This is the beginning of a new tool, so I'm really excited about trying this out. It's an experiment.
Yeah, and it's a very important piece of designing the business that you want and growing business. So it's certainly an important conversation to have and an experiment to try.
I think so. What gets me excited is the fact that people didn't. When you say you can design culture, people look at you as if you're crazy. That's what gets me excited. That we're addressing an issue that's actually pretty hard. That we see, we don't have the same definitions. We think it's a very fuzzy topic. We're making it concrete. The reason I'm so excited about this is because we've seen something similar at the beginning with business models. Not as fuzzy, but people were, talking about crazy different things. Everybody had their own definition. There was no shared language. Here, it's even more extreme. People don't even think they can design culture, yet they can. And that's what makes it so exciting. So I think this is a big shift from something that just happens. Every organization has a culture, but in many, it just happens. We're moving now towards one that we can design, so we can finally design a desired culture. That's what gets me excited.
So I'm going to take one more question and then wrap it up because we're running out of time, unfortunately. The final question is, what minimum requirements should be in place in large corporations so that starting to work on corporate culture has a chance to lead to anything?
So you do need a buy-in from the leadership. And that can be at any level, right? If you want a team to change their culture, the team leader, or at least the people who actually drive the decisions, which maybe is not the team leader, but somebody else, who's creating that organizational culture. You need buy-in from the powerful people to make that happen, and that goes through the entire hierarchy, right? It could start at the bottom, it could start at the top, but you need buy-in. Otherwise, it's super hard to do. It's very rare that you have rebellions in companies. They can end pretty ugly. I mean, we do have whole political infights, but you do need buy-in from leadership. But what makes me confident is that a lot of leaders are excited about doing this. They want to. It's just that they didn't really know how, and probably we have a lot of advocacy work to do to even convince people this can be done. But I do see a lot of people who, when they see this, I've presented this now a couple of times, they get super excited because all of a sudden they realize, wow, we can design a desired culture. Wow, that can lead to a completely different work environment. So once we have buy-in from leadership at any level, I think we can move things because now we have a tool to make it tangible and start that conversation. So we can do the first step.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I just want to mention that you will be at the Lean Startup Conference doing both a keynote presentation and then also a workshop, which is going to be really great for everybody that is going to be there. So strongly encourage everybody listening to go to that. Thank you so much for the time that you spent with us today. It was fantastic to hear from you and talk about this. It's such an important conversation to have.
Thanks for having me. It was an exciting conversation.
Great. Thanks. Back to you, Jeanette.
Thanks to everybody for joining us today. This wraps up our show. In the meantime, don't forget to visit leanstartup.co for more information on the Lean Startup Conference coming up real soon, November 16th through 19th in San Francisco. Thanks so much, everybody. Goodbye.